All right, we're back, and it's COMP1073. That's client-side scripting here at Georgian College, winter 2016 semester. And what we've got here is we're at kind of like the final week of real classes. Next week is the exam. And what I really want to talk about today is kind of do an exam review a little bit, or what we're doing for the exam next week. Now, it's nothing that you haven't seen already. You're going to have to use GitHub. So when I go on the stuff that we've done, if we actually look at some of the work that we've done this semester, and if I was to look at something like our last week, week 12, I'm going to start with this because we're going to talk about Create.js a little bit more today and fix that ad up. So we've been using Visual Studio Code, but some of you have been using, instead of Visual Studio Code, use Dreamweaver or something else. That's totally fine. So I'm not going to force you to do anything on the exam that's different than what you've already done. You need to put together, I'm just using this as an example, by the way. I'm not really saying that Create.js is going to be on the exam or anything like that. But you really need to do something like understand how to structure your projects. So that's one of the things that you're going to be asked to do. How do I structure my projects with JavaScript? How do I attach JavaScript files to my index.html? Understanding that my index.html is a manifest that all the JavaScript files attached to. Let me just get that door for a second. So the ability for us to attach a JavaScript file to our index.html or our documents, and how do we attach, what's the best practices and those kind of things is important to understand. So in most cases, just as a review again, when we attach our documents, usually you put our JavaScript at the bottom of our, near the body tag, the closing part of our body tag inside of our document, index.html. So it's important to understand that and why it happens. Most of the time it's because JavaScript can be something called blocking, right? So which means that if you put it in the head of your document and something goes wrong, potentially you might have a problem with loading the rest of your document. And that's not what we want, because we want to talk about progressive and idea of progressive enhancement way back. How really what we want to do is use HTML5 and CSS to take care of most of our interactivity, right, in our web pages as much as possible, and avoid using JavaScript, even though it's a JavaScript course. We talk about that because unless your HTML5 is semantically correct and our CSS is the design portion and the presentation portion of our web project, right, then adding JavaScript is really useless. I mean, all we're doing is trying to patch up our problems with HTML5 and CSS3, and that's not really good form, right? So the idea that we want to try and have a good semantic site, HTML5-wise, in terms of structure, and presentation-wise, that's all taken care of first, and then we add JavaScript. So that's what we've done here. We've kind of have on the top of the head of our document, we always have our CSS, of course, and then near the bottom, usually is where we attach our JavaScript files. Notice here we have two sections. In our last example that we did last week, we had a whole pile of libraries that we included, right? So jQuery, Bootstrap, Easel, Tween, Sound, Preload, all this stuff that we did last week. And then we attach our actual app.js or our JavaScript working file at the bottom of everything else. Why? Because we want to be able to take advantage of all these libraries, and we have to declare them and include them first. And then we can apply our own custom changes at the bottom. Almost like similar to the cascade idea that we do with CSS. Now, you're going to say, well, Tom, it doesn't really matter because JavaScript is cached, right, inside of our browser. So does it really matter the order that we load things in? And my recommendation to you is it does, right? So it's better that you always put your stuff that you want to access, for example, libraries like jQuery and Bootstrap, if you're going to use those, before your custom app.js. So this an understanding of how to put together your index.html is important. So, I mean, these are the things you need to understand for the exam, right? Will you have to put together your own project for the exam? No, we have no time for that. So I'm probably going to give you a template like we did in midterm. So I'll probably give you a template and say, hey, this is what I want you to do. And it's nothing that you haven't done before. So if I've asked you to do something on a lab or an assignment, then it's fair game for the exam. Anything that I've asked you to do. If I haven't done that, you on it, if I haven't talked about it in class, I'm not going to just shoot something new you've never seen before, because that makes no sense. How are you going to be prepared for the exam if you've never seen it, right? And not because I don't think you can handle it, but because it's not fair. Okay, so that's the stuff that's going to be on there. In earlier lessons, and if I was going to just look at my structure for a second, the things we covered here in class, regardless of what our plans were, which some of it we got a little bit distracted. We talked about things like in the beginning of our course, we talked about how to access the DOM, by using document.getElementById. You need to know that, right? If you don't know how to make a reference to an element with document.getElementById, we get a problem, because I've been doing that like for several times, right? It's not like the first and last time you've ever seen that, right? So if you don't know what that is, you better study up on it, right? Because that's something that's going to be on the exam for sure, 100%. So making a reference to an element and how to read data from your document and actually post data into your web page is really, really important to understand how to do. And we've done that with, with assignment 2 and so on. In the second half of this semester, so I'm going to talk about some of those things. You still need to know about variables, functions, and loops, all the same things that we normally have been doing through this entire course, because that's part of what JavaScript is. I'm not going to focus on there and try and say, write this particular loop or structure. You have to make it work the way you know how from a scripting perspective. We're going to focus more on the second half. So whether it's the multiple choice pieces or the practical piece you're going to be doing for next week, there's going to be some JSON data. Okay, we've been talking about that. We talked about that for a couple weeks, so that's going to be on there. There's going to be jQuery because we talked about that. And if you look at the way the structure is that we talked about, you have to understand how jQuery is a shortcut for JavaScript and what jQuery can do for us differently than JavaScript. And you're going to have to know how to use an API like Create.js. And since we've talked, I'm giving you an application to make, I might have a piece there that has to do with using a piece of Create.js. It doesn't mean that you have to know Create.js. It's not about Create.js. It's about using an API, a JavaScript API. That's all I care about that you know how to use. I could have used Bootstrap as an example. We could have used a number of APIs out there. I just find that Create.js is a little bit more fun and easy to use, right? That's why we use that one. So really, that's it in a nutshell. You'll be asked to use your skills so far. Ajax loading and loading from a file, chances are, will be part of it, right? Because all the pieces that you've kind of put together, it's kind of a culmination of the things that you've done so far this semester, right? Now again, I only have an hour and a half, so you gotta figure that. I can't put too much on there, right? It's got to be some simple application that you're going to kind of put together, a web app that has maybe one piece of core functionality with some ancillary functions. Here's the thing that I will ask you to do. I will ask you to put things up on GitHub. I will ask you to host it somewhere. I'm not going to force you to put it on Azure because I still think there's people here that still don't have Azure access. As long as it's up live somewhere, I will accept that for the final exam, right? And the reason why I'm saying that is because, if you want to use DreamHost, if you want to use at this point DigitalOcean or something else, some other host provider, as long as it's live and I can access it live, we're good. Okay, I'm not going to force you to use Azure for the final exam. So that's kind of what we're doing for the final exam. That's really the plan for next week. Please be early, on time, that kind of thing. It's an individual exam. It won't be that you won't be able to work with other people. Similar to what we did on the midterm. And like I said, I'll probably give. That means that, if you're not really great at multiple choice, then you're going to be really doing bad on that one. And if you're not great at the practical piece, which you all should be by now, then you wouldn't be good at that piece, right? So I figure that a 10-15 split is probably the best way to go. Questions about the exam structure for next week? It'll be laid out just like an assignment, the practical piece, and the true probably be at least 20 questions, all right? I'm just letting you know, it's not going to be that crazy. And all the 20 questions won't be across the entire semester. It'll just be for the second half. So it'll cover things like Ajax, a little bit of JSON, probably some jQuery, just letting you know, right? Those are the things to study. and a little bit of Create.js, the idea for what a canvas is and so on, the things that we talked about last week and the things that we'll be talking about this week. Okay, so nothing again that you haven't seen. I'm not going to focus too much as we go forward. Like, I'm going to do more on jQuery and JSON and less on Create.js because we only introduced it last week, so it doesn't make any sense. You might have a question or two maybe for Create.js or an API, how to use an API, and the rest will be all on the other stuff we've talked about from a true, false, multiple choice. And then for the practical piece, like I said, you'll have a structure I'm going to give you. I'll say, take this structure, use it, and create this, whatever it's going to be, okay, with interactivity or whatever. Exam structure for next week, right? Please come early. I'd rather you guys be like 5 minutes early than late. If you need a lot of you might need extra time if you're not practiced at doing this stuff. On another note, let's talk about your final assignment. Now, originally I had planned a project for this class, but I nixed it. And the reason why I nixed it is because of workload for you guys as well. I've been talking to other professors as well. I know you got a bunch of stuff going on at the same time. And also from a simulation, this is an intro course in terms of JavaScript and things that you can do. I didn't want to pile you up with different assignments, so we've only got 4 assignments for this one. So again, we're going to spread the love in terms of our mark. The way we've got our marks laid out might change in accordance to our spread. So instead of an assignment being 5%, it might be a little more. So that way we get to that 100% we talked about. So that means if you did really well on assignment 1 and 2, and chances are you did, then your marks are going to be very good, right? If you didn't do very well on assignment 1 and 2, then your marks won't be so good, right? That's what it means. And most of you, from what I've seen, and I've looked at your assignments, most of you are fine. There's no problem with any of it. People who haven't handed stuff in, that's going to be a problem, right? Because that means that your assignments will be weighed a little heavier. And if you don't hand it in, that means you're going to get 0 on a bigger piece. That's bad. What I will do, because I know there's some people that still haven't handed things in or they were late to hand things in. If you haven't handed things in, please talk to me. And what I might do is still accept an assignment 1 or an assignment 2 or assignment 3 late and give you some part marks as opposed to 0, right? So it won't be as, a 0 scenario. It's not about that. I still want you to come out knowing something. So if you haven't had a chance to submit those things, please talk to me, and we'll arrange for you to hand it in even now at this late date. I have no problem with that. Okay. Only so that you have a chance to to pass the course for those people who are having trouble. There's quite a few people that had difficulties and issues that have emailed me, and I've made accommodation for them, and I'll make accommodation for anybody else who asks. Okay. So please. Contact me, connect with me so that we can get that done. Let's talk about this final assignment 4, and I guess somehow it came up today. I'm not sure. It might have been my error. Let's talk about this a little bit anyway. It's not that difficult, and I want to give you time for the remainder of the class to work on it here in class so we can fix it. So not like you have to work on it outside of class. I want to help you, and it'd be a great opportunity for us to work one-on-one. Think about this as a one-on-one exam review for next week, right? So I can work with you to get this little ad done that's going to be part of your assignment. So it's almost like, let's do the assignment in class like a lab. The assignment's going to be worth 15% of your final mark. Let's talk about it. So remember the old days, we used to have this idea of a Flash banner ad. Remember that? I don't know if you guys were around that long, but Flash was the big thing, man. It was crazy. Well, now like we said last week, we've swapped out Flash, and we use something like a Create.js to create our ads. Now, it's not always Create.js, but other JavaScript libraries, even jQuery, we use a lot of jQuery to do banner ads these days. So even though I use Create.js suite of JavaScript libraries, and I put in here, or another API of your choice, I'm not going to limit you to just jQuery or JavaScript or Create.js, because Create.js isn't the only one that people use. We use a bunch of other ones out there. There's a lot of other ones you can kind of tap into to use. I recommend Create.js because it's easy to do, right? It's not that it's the only one or the best one. So really what I want you to do is I want you to promote your projects. Remember, you have a mini portfolio site with maybe a project page that shows off your projects. I want you to make a little ad that says, hey, take a look at my project. That's all it's going to be around, right? Think about this as a little test if you were going to do, or if you want to promote another page, that's fine. Some kind of, you want to use your ad to promote a page that's inside of your site. Say, click me, kind of thing, right? Obviously, you're not going to put click me on the ad, right? But something to make the user, the person who's coming in, give them an idea that there's something here that you can click on. A lot of times we use it for customer sites for things like promotions. Like if you want to, click here, to order this product, 15% off this week. One of those kind of things, right? You might think that's silly, but actually that's what I get asked to do the most. Like, can you make a little ad, Tom, so that it promotes our bleach product that we're going to sell at 15% off for next week? Sure. 2 seconds, we get an image of the bleach, and then we, as an example, the bleach bottle, and then we create our, 15% off kind of thing, and it rotates throughout the ad, right? With a little bit of animation. So how do I want it to be set up? So the way it's going to be set up is, I got to set up like this. You have content and functionality. I talked about ad structure, how to set things up together for your little your banner ad, and then of course it's all around sharing it on GitHub and Azure or cloud hosting somewhere, right? So that's really the extent of the little assignment that I'm giving you. And again, you can use CreateJS or another library to make it work. So here's one. Your ad must promote one or more of your projects. All right, that's pretty simple. So it's up to you how you want to accomplish that. Whether you want to say, show a screenshot of your project. Maybe you have a certain project you want to promote, something that you've worked on before, in another class maybe that you want to include in your mini portfolio. Your ad should basically say, hey, look, I've got this project. Click onto it for more details. This is something that I did, kind of thing, right? Your ad must include some animated text. And animated text means something that maybe moves on the screen somewhere. I'm not going to tell you how it moves. I want you to be creative. So you can do things like, maybe it moves up and down. Maybe it moves right to left. It's up to you how you want it to move, like we talked about last week, right? It could be something that the text animates, it changes, or whatever, or morphs somehow. That's up to you as well. Your ad must include some animated graphics, something that moves in the background. And when I say animated, I'm talking about maybe you take a screenshot and it just does one of these, like it just moves around, right? Some kind of movement in the ad has to happen, right? I'm being very, generic here. And when I say movement, think about, moving an actual object, a graphic object across the canvas somehow, right? That's all you're doing. Your ad will accept the user's mouse click, which will redirect the user to the related project page. So when you click on the ad, it takes you to the next page, right? How do I do that, right? So you got to talk about how to do that with JavaScript. And that's kind of, to make it work, that's kind of the key piece of functionality of your ad. It's got to be able to be clickable, right? If it's not clickable, then something's wrong. Your ad doesn't work, right? It's not just to promote the page and have something flashy on the screen. Here's some structure, and I've given you some examples of the most popular ad sizes. A banner, that's 468 by 60. And I'm giving you some specific numbers here, but you don't have to make it exactly this. I want to give you an example. It says it must be one of the following sizes, but I want you to give an example of what they're like even now these days. Again, this is going back to the old YouTube flash ad sizes that we used to use and we still use today. A square, that's 250 by 250 pixels. Skyscraper, and a mobile banner, which can work on mobile, that's 320 wide by 100 tall, right? So any one of these, if you want to choose to use something else, please let me know. As long as it's reasonable, please don't make your ad your whole page. That would be bad, right? That's why I put these in there, so that way it's not like you're going to choose to make your whole ad the whole page. That's just silly, right? And also don't make it too small. Some people say, well, I made an ad, but it's like, it's a thumbnail, right? That doesn't make any sense either, right? So that's why I put these dimensions in, so that you have some kind of idea, a basis to make something that's really realistic, right? Graphic layout. Ads must take up the entire space of the image size you've chosen. So this is important. So I've kind of included a little bit of ancillary work in terms of, hey, if you're going to make an ad, you need to know about how to make an ad, right? So don't make it so that like the ad itself is only, so if your ad space is a rectangle, don't make it so that it only takes up the middle square of the entire space. That makes no sense. So if you're making it a rectangle, make sure you use the whole space of the ad, right? That's important. Relevance and quality, right? So make sure that the text is legible, that you're promoting your project. It's anything that's unclear or blurry or unrecognizable images, those kind of things. Anything skewed, like if you put skewed images on the ad, that's bad. You'll lose marks for that. Please don't make your ads strobe or flash. All right, that is bad for everybody. Some people don't, that affects people negatively. Some people have problems with seeing any kind of strobing ad. It's not good. And typically it's viewed poorly in the marketing industry, right? Don't do a trick to click. Don't make it so that the thing looks like an alert from your operating system, okay, or anything like that. Please don't do those kind of ads. Trust me, I've done this before. I've done this assignment a bunch of times, right? And it's like every time. By the way, all these things come from my bad experiences with other assignments that I put out exactly like this, right? Like where I put it out and someone put like pornography on the ad, right? Like it's just nuts. People put weird things, even though we're in school, they do weird things, right? So please make it family safe, okay? So no inappropriate language, don't use any kind of like, weird hand gestures or anything like that in here. I don't know what else to tell you. I think family appropriate is, it says it all right? I know people are laughing, but trust me, guys and girls, I can't tell you the stuff I've gotten. Sometimes I can't even look at it. I'm embarrassed, right? Your ad's animation must stop upon a click and link to your mini portfolio project page. So even though it says add structure, I've kind of given you marks for this twice. One, because I'm doing it here from a functionality perspective, click to do something. And one, I've kind of separated out in terms of the way it should be structured. So structure your ad so that it needs to be clicked. Like there's a reason for it being there. Almost like, hey, this thing needs to be clicked. Something's going on here. There's some piece of something that looks a little bit more, I don't know, attractive, right? One person asked me another time when we did this exact assignment, they said, well, do you mind if I make a rotator, some kind of like, a gallery or something that if you click on it, that's my ad? No, that's a gallery, all right? That's not an ad. You can certainly advertise across a gallery or some kind of slider, but sliders and ads are becoming less and less chic. They're not part of our new structure, the way we do web pages. So make it simple. This is something that you can sell to your customers, and that's what I want to give you this opportunity to practice. So if you're ever going to do something practical in the real world, you've done an ad before. You know how to make an ad, some kind of piece with a canvas, right? Why a canvas and why not CSS? Because you can do a lot of this with CSS3. Yes, you can. But the great thing about using a canvas is it's cross-platform, just like CSS, and it gives you a lot more control with JavaScript. Again, this is a JavaScript assignment, so it's kind of a little bit contrived, I'll be honest with you, trying to make an ad with JavaScript. But it's there to practice your JavaScript skills, to make sure things work, it's going to practice all the skills you've learned so far. Looping, like how to make a loop, how to do conditional statements to make sure that things work. Remember we talked about that last week, to check the bounds of the ad. If I want to move text around the screen and all that, we've talked about that. I used kind of almost everything I could last week. You can also use things like JSON data if you want to populate your ad with other kinds of data, like dynamic data. Some people do that as well, because sometimes your ad is too static and you want to change the images or the stuff you're promoting. So you make a generic background, right, as an example, and then what you do is you rotate the images out by using JSON data every week. So you have different images and so on. That's kind of an advanced little piece of code. I don't expect that kind of stuff from you, but you can use that if you want. Of course, the last piece is share your files on GitHub and your cloud, whatever it is, your cloud provider, right? So how do you submit? A zip archive of your project files, please. GitHub repository, link to that, and a link to your mini portfolio site, the updated one, because you're going to make an updated version of your portfolio site. Hosted on your cloud provider. Please make another link. Please don't link to the original one that you're using if you have a mini portfolio site. Just make a copy of your stuff into another repository. It's not like GitHub is going to get mad at you for making another repo, right? It's like they go, hey, you can only have 5 repos on GitHub. It's not true, right? And oh my God, you can only have like 5 sites on Azure. That's not true either, right? So make as many sites as you need to. It's easier for me to mark and so on. 15% of your mark is due next week, Thursday. Same day we get together on the exam date by midnight. So a week, I'm going to try and give you as much time today as to do this in class, and I want to try and help you to do it, right? So it's not like you're going to do it completely by yourself. Questions are on this one. So we're using Create.js. Let's do a bit of a recap on what we did last week in terms of Create.js to show you what we did for those people that aren't able to attend or didn't quite get it when we did it last week. So that's your assignment. It's up on Blackboard. Okay, so I'm just using, I'm here in a project COMP1073, which is also up on GitHub. So if you're actually going to look on GitHub here to follow along, and if I was to look at the college, if I can type properly today. Oh. George Peterson, I don't know how that, Georgian College. There we go. It's really weird. Chrome is acting weird for me today. So if I look back at COMP1073 lesson 12, there it is, right? Last day. So you can always download this if you haven't had a chance to look at it or put it together. It includes the entire site structure. One thing that we've been talking about over the last several weeks is the idea of getting code hinting with using something called TSD, right? Or the TypeScript definition library. As of, I guess it would have been last week, it's officially been deprecated. So this is how the web moves, right? As we continue to create stuff, week to week, things change. And one of the things that's changed is TSD has been deprecated, and they prefer to use something called typings. It's okay to use TSD for the rest of our semester, okay? It's not going to kill you to use a deprecated, it's not going to not work or not function anymore. All TSD is, excuse me, is a way for you to get code hinting for your jQuery right now and on your Create.js libraries. So here's my recommendation. If you're going to make your ad, use lesson 12 as a nice basis for your kickoff point. Don't try and recreate the wheel if you're going to make an ad work. You can also incorporate the piece parts of lesson 12 into your mini portfolio site. So if something's missing, you can certainly grab things like the typings folder. You can also, like, that typings folder is important. The idea that what typings are is, again, it's the code hinting. And if you look at it, it includes things like Create.js lib, easel.js, jQuery preload. These are just what typings do is it gives us code hinting or IntelliSense for our JavaScript libraries, right? Something that's been in play ever since TypeScript came out. It's something that's been released from Microsoft to help us to structure our JavaScript for larger applications. And again, being used widely by Google with their Angular 2 project that's out right now, a full model view controller or MV star framework. And if you guys are curious, we can always go to angularjs.org where they have two projects. One of them is the old AngularJS 1, again, a front-end framework. We just talked about an API. I have to talk about this, so you've heard the name. If you haven't heard it already, AngularJS. A full front-end framework that uses JavaScript to control data. It has a bunch of different methodologies. It's a very opinionated kind of framework that we can use to create robust application-level web projects. Okay, so actual web app as opposed to a website. Okay, now Microsoft and Google have combined forces to create Angular 2. Microsoft giving them TypeScript, which is the backend language that is a superset of JavaScript, and Google, which is creating this whole new idea for Angular 2. So if Microsoft and Google are combining to do that, like as I mentioned before, then that's a good indication that TypeScript is going to be around for a while, right? And it uses the best of ECMAScript 6 or ECMAScript 2015, which is the latest version of JavaScript, still not wholly supported by every browser that's out there. It's actually got very little support. And if I was to look at can I use, and if I put in something like, which browser support it, if I put something like class, if I was going to put the class structure, right? So a class itself, there's a lot of different things that it includes. Not just class name, but the default class declaration here. See where it is. Actually, it's not here. Or if I was to, any kind of ECMAScript 6 stuff, you can see how much it's supported. Let's see if I can put ECMAScript ES6. There it is. If I put ES6, REST parameters, you can see some spotty support across different browsers. Chrome, of course, is always one that supports early, and Firefox. Those are the two ones that support early for arrow functions and the const keyword. Look at this. The const keyword, which is a constant, still only supported, some partial support across different browsers. And as we continue going with ECMAScript 2015, you could certainly look at some compatibility tables across different parts of functionality for ECMAScript 6 and 2015. Right? Here's your TypeScript in Core.js, and you can see that how it's supported across browser, depending on the current browser that you're using. Guys and girls, it's something that you're going to be exposed to as we go forward. And one of the things to understand is script is the first step on the journey to understanding how to use, kind of program on the web. Two parts, I would say, if I was going to put it like this to you, it's always like this: one part HTML, two parts CSS, and when it comes to a web application, 4 parts JavaScript. It's really crazy heavy, right? And the reason for that is because JavaScript is quickly becoming the #1 language in the world, not just for the web, but if you look at statistics, it shows on GitHub, it shows that JavaScript is the #1 language. From a money-making perspective, Java, if you were going to be a programmer, Java would be #1. If you were going to actually work in the field, Java #1. C# is a great language as well, but JavaScript for the web is the #1 language. So if you don't know how to do JavaScript, and if you're going to be a web developer, if that's your forte, that's a problem. You need to learn JavaScript. It's overcome PHP. PHP, again, is in a kind of a downward spiral, right? Slowly. They've been trying to revive it with things like Laravel and other kinds of frameworks like that, Cake PHP, and so on. But more or less, slowly, it's going away. Even from a WordPress perspective, WordPress for many years has been a PHP backend. They've got something called WordPress API, which is a REST API they've come out with that is going to have a WordPress front end with any backend. When you want to use Node.js, like a JavaScript backend, or if you want to use something like ASP.NET, then eventually WordPress will work with any backend framework, not just PHP. But for now, it's only PHP, and it's going to move away from that because people at WordPress understand that PHP is becoming less popular. All right, so that's really it in a nutshell for what we're going to be doing today. We're going to be talking about Create.js. Let's take a look at this this thing that we kind of put together. I'm not going to make a new project like the lesson 13 today. I'm just going to use lesson 12 for the stuff from lesson 12 from last week to kick off, just to remind you what we did last week as a review, because this is the stuff you're going to need to know for your assignment. So I'm going to kind of open this in Terminal. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to run this thing. So I'm also going to open it up in my in Finder, and I want to show you what happens. If I was to go here and double-click on my index.html, am I going to be successful in making my website run? Do you guys remember? If I double-click right now, just from a file perspective on index.html, would that work? Why would it not work? I got JSON data, and if I want to run things, I want to read JSON from my, from my page. I have to have this project hosted on a server somewhere. Okay, so that's review for you guys for next week for sure. JSON again is a format, file format. I can certainly use XML, right, which is extensible markup language as for data. Not as used anymore as much as JSON in terms of data that we use. Still in use, but not as, it's kind of not as popular these days. And when we use AJAX, and by the way, some people will say AJAX stands for asynchronous JavaScript and XML. It doesn't stand for that. AJAX is just nowadays, I want you to think about it as a way of accessing asynchronously any files or data that's on the server, right? We used AJAX in this project to load up a partial page, our navbar, right? And if I was to double click on this thing, because I'm not on a server, my navbar, as an example, would not appear, right? So notice there's no navbar, there's just a big dotted line here as an example that shows off, how big our canvas is. Remember, our canvas is an element that we can scale to draw on. That's what we're using the element for. The canvas element, the HTML5 canvas is what we're using to draw on. This is where your ad is going to appear. Now my canvas right now is like the whole page. That's not good for your ad. Remember I talked about it being too big? That's too big for your ad. Like you can make a whole game this way, yeah. Make a game if you want, right? But that's not what we're doing today. I right-click and do inspect, see what the problem is, just to prove what I'm saying. You can see that I have some uncut type errors. Cannot read property rotation of null. That's a problem, right, for my app.js. And I also have some other type errors that I have. If I refresh the screen, I have other issues too. I have things like my XML HTTP request. I have a problem. This is bad, right? And this is because I'm trying to access stuff that is not hosted by a server. I got some other problems here in my code as well, and I got to fix this up in order for me to make it work. Let's see what the problem is, or what the problem could be, right? Okay, so let's fix this up. So how do I fix it? There's a couple of ways, and again, you can run a local server. So kind of one of the servers I've been using for a while now is under npm. There's something called HTTP server. That's the one I've been using, which is an npm module. And we talked about loading Node a while back and how we can use this little zero configuration command line server to run in the background. It's cross-platform, Windows, Mac, and Linux, as long as you have Node and npm installed in your system, which by now all of you should have, right? As a requirement, right? Okay, so if that's true, let's run HTTP server and see what the difference, what happens now. So if I run it here locally, and if I go here to the page, and if I run localhost 8080, and I get this. I get a bit of my About Me page, my Projects page, my Contact Me page, but I still have a problem. Well, there it is. I should have had a problem with my ad. Well, here's my little button, and it's taking up the whole page, right? How did I do this thing last week? Well, remember what we did? We created a label, right? Which is one part, which is the Hello World label. And we use the button image, a bitmap, that we can rotate across the ad, right? So this is how we're doing it. Now, this is pure JavaScript, right? If I click onto it, you can see that it's clicked. It actually does something. If I hover over it, I get this hover effect happening or whatever. Now, this, you might say, it's interesting, Tom, but does it work cross-platform? Well, one thing you notice is that it immediately scales when I kind of change the size of my screen, because the way I've kind of programmed everything. So it scales. It is fully compatible with mobile right now. If I was to refresh the screen, you can see that it would would be bigger initially, and it would be a lot faster going back and forth, right? Still works with this. So everything on the page that normally works will still work with this one. If I scale up, right, it's going to scale so that it's crazy, and this is a problem, right? So scaling the ad, if I wanted to make it so that it's responsive, we have some more work to do. Will I need your ad to be responsive? No. That's a little bit the next level when it comes to how to make things work. Because we have to talk about things like, well, if I make it responsive, do I really want to make my ad scale? Or do I want to change the images, swap out the images for my platform, which is the better way of doing things? And there's different ways of doing that, accomplishing the same thing. But for us, all we want to do is, let's target desktop. Okay, we're not going to target mobile for now. And when we target desktop, I want you to make it so that it's desktop compliant. Okay, not necessarily 100% mobile or responsive, a responsive ad. If I go to my projects page, it partially works, but I've got a bit of an issue. And contact page works. All this stuff, my nav bar is working as a partial that I've loaded in with Ajax, just as a review, right? So if I was to look at my page, I can see that I have a couple things here. I have something called the main header, and I also have, this is my index.html, my footer. No real data in here, and in the middle I have something called a canvas, and the canvas element is what we're drawing on. Think about it as a dry erase board, all right? Like something like this, a whiteboard, right? And if I draw something on it, and if I want it to move, right? If I want something on my dry erase board to move, what do we have to do? We have to draw it, erase it, redraw it, erase it, redraw it, and keep erasing it over and over again. The idea behind that is exactly what we're doing, but we're doing it 60 frames a second. So we're redrawing this board 60 times every second. That's pretty darn fast. I couldn't do that with my hand. I don't even if I had a bunch of you up here at the same time to do it, we couldn't do it fast enough, right? What I mentioned last week as a review also was that frame rate. If I talk about frame rate in general, 60 frames a second is a great frame rate for games. Typically, we use 24 frames per second for any kind of film animation, even now, right? Because it's easy for us to do things like walk cycles and those kind of things if you're an animator at 24 frames per second. Once we go into the realm of 30 frames per second, then our animation walk cycles become a little bit more complex. And as we get into the 60 frames per second range, there's many, many more something called in-betweens that happen between keyframes, right? So you have some keyframes, some frames that you're going to use for the walk cycle, and then what happens is the computer can interpolate between the two positions. So you might have an initial position for animation and a final position. We want to move something from one position to the other. We can do something. We can actually fill in the blanks, right? The computer can draw all those frames using interpolation. In this case, it's not doing that. What we're doing actually physically is begin. I'm going to bring this up a little bit. So look at fireworks, right? Here's fireworks, just a drawing program. Again, you can use whatever drawing program you like. Let's pick a size that's compatible with one of our ads for today. So I'm going to go back to courses, and inside our final assignment 4, if I look at some of the sizes here, let's pick one, right? And there's some really weird ones here. One of them is this 468 by 60. That's a really weird one. A banner ad, 468 by 60. Let's see what that looks like physically. And you can test that in fireworks, right? So let's make a new file. And we'll say 468 by 60. It's kind of a weird size, right? 100K, 109K so far, kilobytes. We're going to make the background transparent so we can see it, and there it is. That's what a 468 by 60 ad looks like, right? Now you might say that's kind of small, but that's the size. That's one of the standard sizes that used to be on YouTube back in the day, right? 468 by 60. Still exists today, by the way, except we don't use Flash anymore. Okay, so so this is an ad we want to do something with. There's not a lot you can do in here, right? I mean, what are you going to do? Have a piece of text that scrolls across, like as a little scrolling text? Sure, you could do that in this particular case. But this is what 468 by 60 would look like. Let's check some other ones out, right? So another one would be 250 by 250. This is a little bit more useful. Let's modify the canvas to make it 250 by 250. So it's not as wide, and it's still quite small, but it's square, right? Here you can do some other things. You can take a snapshot of your project and put some scrolling text or something in the background, some kind of image that scrolls or moves from one side to the other, right? So there's another format for you. 300 by 250 is a rectangle. I'm not going to go into that. The skyscraper is very popular, 120 by 600 still. So if I go into modify canvas size, so 120 wide. Notice it's not 60, thank God. By 300, right? It's called the skyscraper idea. We have something like this, where you can kind of rotate something in there. Now this is actual size. So whatever you see here on the screen is the size that it would appear on your page. So they're not big, right? Certainly you can make them bigger if you like, right? But I want you, the idea here is you can choose whatever size ad you want. I'll give you some examples of ads that you could, ad sizes you can choose. But please don't make them too small or too big, all right? It would not be good for me to do that. And I'll sit down with you guys today to order this up. So if I want to, I mean, in our page today, what we've done so far is, and I look at my JavaScript, if I go to scripts, and if I go to app.js, we notice that there's a couple things we've kind of set up. One of the things that we've set up when we set up this whole script here is a little bit more complex script than we've seen before, is we say, well, our screen width is the window inner width, right, whatever the size of my window is, times 0.8. So I'm saying take 80% of my window width, and that's the width of my screen. Okay, that's what I've done. So if that's true, and if I go back to my ad, let's go back to my ad for a second that I've got going on. Well, that's somehow not working, right? Because that's not 80%, it's 100%, right? So that's one. The second thing is that we can specify a number. So instead of it being my screen width being my window width times 0.8, I could certainly say something like this. I can make a variable that says my window width, screen width is 640. Let's say I make my window 640 by 480, like we did before. I could specify an actual value here, right? So I can say screen width is 640, and my screen height is equal to 480, like a hard-coded value. And then what I can do in here is, and this is one of the problems, I got to do something like screen width to string. So I got to make this a string, right? And that's probably why it didn't work. And screen height to string, like that as well, so that we can set the attributes of our width and height this way. Hey, here's a question. Why am I making variables that are screen height and screen width? Why don't I just code it manually, like just put it in here? Well, it's far easier for me just to put the value in here and get it converted, because if I want to make my ad a different size, like 250 by 250, let's try that. So 250 by 250, right? So I want to make my ad a certain size. I can do that with this code. I'm not going to change some of this stuff right now, like the move and so on. I'm just going to look and see if there's anything else I need to change so it doesn't mess things up, because my size seems not this is going to be a problem. If I make it 250 by 250 and my button Y, the Y-axis is, you know, going up and down on the vertical, right? So going back to old math, right? Let's go back to a different screen size. So if I go to a canvas size that's 640 by 480, actually let's do it 500 by 500 to make it even, so you can see what I'm talking about here. Here's 500 by 500, so kind of a bigger square, right? So the way we measure it is the top left corner of my image is the 0, 0 point, always in computers, right? When we draw anything, all that stuff, and this goes back to kind of you know, graphics 101, right? Top left corner of the screen is 0, 0. And as we go across the screen, that's the x-axis, we increase, look even here, you can see that this is 0, and we increase it up to 500. So 500 pixels across by 500 pixels down. So positive y, just to give you that idea, when it comes to graphics, is down, right? Positive y is down here, and positive x is to the right. So down and to the right, down on the bottom, this is 500, 500x and 500y. Down here, this is the actual coordinate, right at the bottom corner of the screen. Right? And it's important for you to note that because some people get confused with coordinate systems, you know, with the computer and so on, right? I don't want you to be confused. That's what it is. Top left corner is 0, 0. Bottom right corner is where the 500, 500 is, right? Well, that means if I want to position something at 200, 200, and let's put something on the screen. Let's play here with fireworks as an example. I've got a rectangle I want to put on the screen somewhere. And I draw it on the screen. There it is. And let's make it so that there's a bit of a border. Just to give an example, we'll make it a black border so you can see it. Right now, the positioning is 113 by 113. You can see it here. The width and the height is 113 by 113. Let's make it so the width and the height is 100 by 100, just to give you an exact idea of what this looks like. But you can see that the x-coordinate is 100, so 100 over. Here it is. Look at it right here. And then the y-coordinate is 70 down. So if you look at on the left here, you can see that if I go down, it's about 70 down, right, 100 by 70. If I want to make it to the top left corner of the screen, I can certainly position it at the 0, 0 mark. And you can see that it'll go to the top left corner of the screen, right? So 0, 0, top left corner of the screen. Now, if I put it at 500 by 500, it'll disappear. Why? Because this object, like all objects in CreateJS by default, the focal point or the registration point for this object that I've drawn is also the top left corner of the screen, top left corner of the object, right? So I move it from this point, top left corner of the object, right? Whether it's a circle or whether it's a rectangle, square, something irregular, it's always the top left corner of the screen, or by the object, sorry, by default. So let's move this to the bottom right, and you can see that it'll disappear. If I say 500 by 500, so here's 500. You can see that automatically. Well, that's the width. I meant the x is 500. It's gone, right? Well, here it is. It's just outside of our stage, right? Here's where it is. It's outside. And again, if I move it down to 500, you'll just be beyond our ability to see, right? So that's a key point. Let's move that back. So let's undo that change, right? Well, one thing is, if you notice the object itself, I have some other options here for my object here in Fireworks. But on the from a JavaScript perspective, one thing we talked about last week is that you can change the registration point or the focal point of all objects by specifying regx and regY. This is part of our API documentation. So if I was to go look at a bitmap, let's take a look at the CreateJS libraries. This is what we used last week. If I go CreateJS, right? This is the library we're using. And if I look at easel.js, which is one of the libraries of the CreateJS suite of libraries, and I look at docs, and if I look at bitmap, right, which is what we're looking at, you can see that the bitmap has several properties, right? Here's all of our properties. On the index, it shows you all the properties and methods. These are all the things that you can use when we programmatically here in JavaScript. We can use any one of these methods, properties, or even events to program something with a bitmap, right? So an example of that would be, I want to scale an object on the X and Y axis. I have a property called scale X and scale Y, right? I also have things like, regx and regY. There's what regx and regY are. And regx is the registration point, right? So the focal point or the pivot point of your object. Each, right? You could specify it per object, right? But by default, it's the top left corner of the object, right? And it's important for you to know that when positioning things across the canvas, okay? Questions around this? Right? So I want to talk about this so that when we position things across the screen, across the canvas, we're not doing too many crazy things, but just to understand. Let's go back to the code for a second. So here we have a problem. If I make my ad 250 by 250, and yet in my label, my hello label, I make my hello label, what it's going to be. As an example, here it is, my button, and here's my label. And I said, let's position my label at 240. Well, that makes no sense anymore because 240, being the center of the screen, makes no sense, right? So we have to kind of think about, I can't position this at 240 anymore if I want it to be the center of the screen. I got to kind of say, take my, you know, my screen height and divide it by 2, or and usually what we want to do, it's much better from a computer graphics perspective, and I want you, if you're going to learn anything from this, takeaways, whatever, is please multiply by 0.5 instead of dividing by 2. I know it sounds crazy, but actually multiplying by 0.5 is more efficient coding-wise than dividing by half, right, by 2. And the reason for that is because the way the computer interprets your mathematical functions. It might sound crazy, but really when you're using 60 frames per second and you're calculating things over and over again every second, it adds up, and it makes your ad more responsive. So let's do that. So let's kind of come down here and say, well, instead of making button Y a fixed number like 240, let's change this to screen height times 0.5, just like we did screen width times 0.5 for our button. So we'll do the same thing here. So we're making it a value that we're changing. Here's something we talked about. This is my button object. Now there's a lot of little properties that we're changing in our button object. We're changing the scale property to make it half as big because our button was really huge when we got it from the internet last week, right? So we scaled it to half the size. That's what we did, right? That's one. And the other thing that we've done is we've talked about our button X and Y coordinates. X and Y coordinates physically in our canvas, right? That's what we've done here, right? Reg X and Reg Y is the pivot points, and all we've done here is we've used 2 different kinds of methods. One for a bitmap, which is getBounce, and one for a text type object, which is getMeasuredWidth. It equates to the same. What it does is it measures the size of our object, so we can get the middle of our object from a registration point perspective. So we're putting we're setting the registration mark in the middle of our object by measuring it first and dividing it by 2, right? In both X and Y directions. Okay. This piece here, which we did last week, was create an event, right? And instead of using add event listener, CreateJS has a little shortcut called on. So instead of using button.add event listener, we said button.on, and on is equivalent to using the event listener, add event listener, button.on. And what this says is on click, right? Whenever we click on the button, then what I want to do is I want to change the property of the label, the text property of the label, to clicked. That's what we're doing here. That's how this works. And again, then we have to reset the X and Y, the registration marks for the label, because the size of our text has changed. And if we want the clicked text to appear in the middle of our label again, then we have to change the registration marks. That's what we did last week. We also have a couple of more events that we specified for our button. One of them is a mouse over and a mouse out event. And I specified also for CreateJS that you can't make those work unless you turn on something called enable mouse over. This enable mouse over property of our stage, what it does is it actually takes up a little bit of overhead, and we only want to turn it on when we need to. If we want to do some kind of button UI, then we turn on this enable mouse over event so you can get these mouse events working. Otherwise, if you're making something like a game, you don't want to have this turned on because it takes too much overhead and it slows down your frame rate. Let's take a look and see how it looks now that I've adjusted my screen width and screen height, right, to see how that works. So let's go into the actual app, right? And I'm just going to refresh the screen. And you can see that it's pretty massive, right? It's pretty massive. And it looks like also that the height of the actual object is pretty big, and then it disappears. If I do it again, let's try that again. There it is, right? So how come it's so massive? I mean, I said it was, remember we talked about this last time. We said I only want to make it 250 by 250. Well, I made a change to this thing again just to go back and so you can see it. In our CSS, notice that the width I've labeled as 100%, which is actually affecting the width of our screen. We don't want this width 100% in here. I mentioned this before, just because you can still affect things by programmatically this way. If I take it away, I go back here and refresh, you can see now that this is the actual size for our object, right? Now see how the size of our button didn't change, right? And it still kind of rotates within this add space, right? The space that we've created. Okay, what about if I want to center this whole thing or move this thing around? Well, remember that this canvas element is just an element that we can reposition on the screen just like any other element with CSS. I don't want to use JavaScript here. I want to use CSS to reposition this thing. And if I want this thing in the middle of my screen, zero auto, right? Yeah, zero auto is what I want to use for this. Now, here's something in my index.html. Remember, we talked about good semantic HTML. I have just the canvas element here, right? Canvas elements are funny, right? Remember we talked about this? And the problem with canvas elements, once we specify height and width and all that kind of weird stuff, we get into trouble, right? But what if I wrap this canvas element within inside of a div tag, right? Or some kind of section tag or something else. It would be easier to control that space than to control the canvas element itself. Let's try this out. So if I say something like this, if I say my div is a tag that's with a class of add, I don't know, here's my add class, right? And then I can position my canvas inside of here. There we go, my canvas. Well, now I have complete control. I can actually say that my add, right, is the thing that's going to have zero auto. I can kind of position it so that my width is 100%, right? For my div tag, not for my, and actually it wouldn't be 100%, it'd be 80%, right? Width is 80%, and then zero auto, so it'd have kind of space on both sides, right? Let's try this out. App. I'm going to target anything with a class of add, right? And I want to say something like this. My width for my add is 80%. Let's try 80% for a second. And my from a margin perspective, I want to kind of specify 0. So remember when we do the box model, we start off at the top, counting to the right. So we go, top right, bottom left, right? That's how we count the box model, right? And if we only use 2 values, each value stands for the top, but the first one is top and bottom, and the second one is right and left. So we can say something like 0 auto, and that specifies that the top margin for our div tag is 0, but we're going to use auto to fill in the blanks between our the right and left margins. So if I do that, let's see what the effect we have is. Did I save? I did. Refresh. You can see that it's kind of over here, right? It's kind of weird. How come it's here and not over here, right? Sorry? Well, let's do a little bit of inspection. It's happening thing. This is important for us to do, right? Remember that our div tag is a wrapper that wraps everything else up, right? So if I look at our body tag, and if I was to inspect our div tag, it's right. Like you see that it takes up 80% of the screen, right? But yet our canvas element is kind of in the middle. It's kind of hanging out in the middle here, right? And remember, if I was to specify 80% for my canvas element, it would stretch the hell out of it, right? And make it all weird. We don't want to do that. We want to move this thing, and I want to center it onto the screen. So how do I center the actual object? It's kind of a weird thing to do, right? I want to center the object, and if I'm not wrong, it's text. Sorry? Yes, text. So if I go text align, I hate to say this way, if I go text align center, right, for our object, I know this is kind of weird, right? But if I go back to this and refresh, right, you can see that it goes right to the middle, right? I'm just saying, right, guys? It's just, CSS is weird this way, right? I'm just saying, right? This is the way you could work it, right? But at least this way, what you can do is you're making your ad appear right in the middle of your screen if you really choose to do that, which, let's face it, guys and girls, your ad should not be in the middle of your screen, right? It should be somewhere where you want to position it, whether it's absolute or with inside the framework that you want it, right? Now, if you want to use Bootstrap, you can certainly push around your div tag with Bootstrap so it takes up a certain amount of space on your screen. That's another thing you can do. Let's try that way, right? So one way, that's kind of one way of doing it. Let's use Bootstrap instead because we want to talk about this as well. So instead of our ad being 80% zero auto, let's get rid of this thing. And let's go back and use Bootstrap. So we're going to go back into our into my index.html here. And instead of our ad being a class of add, we're making a class of row. What we also want to do is we want to surround this div tag with another div tag. I know it's kind of weird, but that's how Bootstrap works. We'll say div tag with a class of container, right? And then we'll take this row and we'll put it inside the container div tag. Again, this is just structure, right? And then what we want to try and do is say something like this. Our canvas element has a certain amount of columns it takes up, which means we're going to have another div tag. I'm just putting this out there for you so you understand what I'm talking about here. So there's a div tag, and then this is our container. So we want to say something like this. We want to have our actual add take up a certain number of columns in a 12-column grid, right? This is kind of Bootstrap 101, right? So how many columns in our 12-column grid does this take up? Well, if you think about each grid space is approximately 8% of your screen, just putting it out there, right? 8% of your screen. And if I want to add up 8% so I get a decent size, right? I'm probably want something like 5 or 6 columns that I want to take up, right? So 6 times 8 is 48, about 50% of the screen, let's say. My ad's going to be quite big, much bigger than what I have it right now. Let's try this, but I want to say something like this. So column medium 6, right? That's the size of our columns. How many columns we want to take up? But that doesn't mean that it's going to be centered. If I want to center it, I want to kind of put it in an offset. So I also want to do something like this. Column, medium, offset, if I'm not wrong. I want to put in something like, I don't know, if I have 6, then I still have, I don't know, 3 on each side. So something like that, right? And let's just take away the extra space and see what we get. We can use Bootstrap. We can look at the Bootstrap API to see how this all works properly. Okay, cool. Let's take a look. Let's get rid of this, and let's refresh. And what's going on? Oh, there it is. See? Now, if I was to inspect it, that was just a little bit too quick. If I inspect this thing, you can see again that if I look at the class of row, it takes up this much space, right? If I go into this, I can see how many rows it takes. It's not quite centered. You can see how it centers off there. And if I want to really target this thing right in the middle, I could do the same thing. I could say something like text align center to center this piece in here, or give it more of a, it looks like I've given it 6 columns, but I don't need 6 columns. I need something like 3 columns. That's that's more accurate. You see where I'm going? Because my ad is only 250 by 250. It looks like 3 columns or 4 columns will suffice, right? Let's change this up a little bit. So if I make it 4 columns and I want it centered, right? So if this is 4 columns and I have 12 columns totally, offset means I'm pushing it from the left, right? How many columns I want to push it from the left, right? Then 4 and 3 is 7, which means I got 5 left over, right? So it means I'm probably going to have to give it at least 1 or 2 columns more on the left, right? So let's try 2. Right, and see how that works out. So 2 columns, sorry, I meant let's go 5. So 5 columns on the left, 4 columns in the middle, and whatever's left over. 5 and 4 is 9, and 3 on the right, right? Maybe make it 4. Let's try 4. Sorry, just trying this out. And if I refresh, it's kind of more centered. And I keep doing that until I push it where I want it to be. Again, if I inspect the page, I can see how close I am from a columns perspective with a 250 by 250 ad. And if I go into my body tag, and again, if I go into my container, you can see that here's my row, and here's my column offset. So still, even with 4 columns for a 250 by 250 ad, still looks like I have about another column of extra space that I don't need to. Now I could physically inside that column space center my ad, and then I could target it the same way. So let's try and do that. So again, I have this class, right, of column middle 4 or whatever. I could put in things like text centered, right? And if I want to check out without using any additional CSS, if I want to check out the Bootstrap API really quickly, so we go to Bootstrap, get bootstrap.com. And if I look there, that's really weird today. If I look and see from a CSS perspective, right, it gives us some ideas of all the stuff it can do. Here's our grid system, right? And it talks about how to align things with the grid, and it creates almost like a media query with CSS to kind of align our grid to different size screens, right? Now I'm using the medium size grid, and you can see that there's 12 columns across the grid. And I'm just deciding that I want these middle 3 columns or 4 columns to be in the middle. Well, a lot of times there's extra information, other kinds of tags you can use instead of you coding your own CSS style. Sometimes it's impossible. You have to do yourself. This is what I've done. I've kind of offset things by from the left with Bootstrap. You can also nest columns and do all kinds of nice things, column ordering. But the one thing I'm looking at is anything that allows me to center my text, that kind of stuff, because or my images or my whatever I'm going to put in there, right? So, is that what it is? And that's a Bootstrap thing? Center dash block? Let's try it out. I don't mind. It's not going to hurt me. So I'll do something like this. I'll say center block. Text center works too. Text center like this. Let's try that. Oh, the whole block is saying. Right. There you go. The center block works too. But let's try that what you said. So center block, center dash block. Let's try that as well. Now is that for the canvas cell or the div tag? It's a div tag. So center dash block. I want to see if that works differently. Center dash block. And let's go back in here and refresh. Yeah, no. Looks like that messed things up. So text center. Tell me. Well, this isn't CSS. This is just Bootstrap, right? We're just using Bootstrap. So text center, I think, is the one we want. Text center, which is kind of weird, okay, because it's not really text. It's just container. It's a container object that we're centering, right, with it. So that's one thing that it'll do. By the way, if you get this, it's not an error. It's because I'm trying to do a bunch of stuff. You can see that I've got some stuff going on. If I refresh the screen again, it comes back. So bear with me. You know, I'm also using a little server, HTTP-server that's running in the background. That's allowing me to do this. Okay, cool. We got some pieces of this ad that I'm rotating in, but I got a problem. I think my button is still too big, right, for this ad, my 250 by 250 ad, right? How do I change this up around to make this work? That's more reasonable. I can make my button smaller, and then that could help me. So how do I do that? Go back. Remember in my app.js inside my scripts here, I also have I changed the scale of my object, of my button, to 0.5. 0.5 on both the X and Y axes, right? After I've changed the registration mark to the middle. So I can do that. I can say something like, instead of 0.5, let's go to make it 0.3, maybe. I could go 0.25 as well, but it doesn't matter. Let's refresh. You can see that the button becomes a little bit smaller now, right? My text is a little bit too big. If I want to change the size of the text, I can also monkey with that. So instead of 40 pixels in Solus, I can go into something like 30 pixels. Try that first for the size of my ad. That's probably more reasonable, right? And again, you can see how it immediately responds to my new size, right? Even when I click it, you can see that if I want to click it again, I can kind of create behavior like that as well. Now I've made just this little button that bounces around, but you can certainly make it so that your whole background image moves around the screen. You can also make it so that your image resizes. So if I want to make my button resize every time it moves, it can go grow large and from large to small. I can do that too. And I can do that every frame. I can say, well, change the size of my button every frame. When it gets to a certain point, go the other way, just like I've done with my border, right? So if you notice I have an animation loop. This is the other piece of this whole puzzle. My animation loop is where all the fun happens, right? This runs every frame. And this is happening because I have an event that's running in the background. This is where I'm using actually add event listener. But one thing I could have done, instead of add event listener, I could have used something like on, because on is a shortcut, like I talked about before, right? Also, if you look at one thing that's happened lately, this thing says deprecated. Deprecated means that it used to function, but now the latest version of the library, we don't prefer to use it this way. And from a backwards compatibility perspective, it says, sure, you can use this methodology, this method, to set the frame rate, but the better way is to make use of the frame rate property. So what it's actually asking us to do is do something like this. So frame rate is equal to 60, right? Which makes more sense. So create.js has also changed in the time that we've installed it, so that set FPS, the old method of setting the frame rate, is gone, and they want us to use frame rate, right? That also happens with an API. All right, so we set the frame rate here, and notice that on tick, every frame we want to call our animation loop. That's what this is doing. And our animation loop is here. This is where every frame, this refreshes the screen. So refreshes the canvas that we're drawing on 60 times a second right now. That's what's happening, right? Right, this is back to reality, back to the frame rate. You can see how everything's going to slow down on our screen for a second. Watch. So I've changed the frame rate. Go back here and refresh, and you can see now that this is 24 frames per second, much slower. The same stuff is happening, right? But what's happening now is it's much slower and a little bit more jerky, if you notice from a screen perspective. Why? Animation works great with 24 frames per second, but from a computer perspective, it seems like 30 frames and 60 frames works a little bit nicer. See how jerky. Now I could have changed the rate of its rotation. I could have changed the rate of everything else. What frame rate does means refresh my screen, redraw my race board only 24 times every second, so a lot less times. So that creates a more of a less slices of time, means I don't refresh so often, and I can see more jerky movement. Now, one thing to note for us, from a human being perspective, is our persistence of vision doesn't really go beyond 30 frames per second. So anything beyond 30 frames per second, our eyes can't tell the difference, right? So let's check this out. So here's 24 frames. Tell me the difference between 24 and 30, and I'll tell you right now, you're going to be challenged to figure that out. There's 24, and here's 30. It's going to be a little faster. It's going to be a little faster, but and maybe a little smoother, but that's it. A little bit, but that's it, right? In terms of can you tell it's any faster than 24? No, so close, 24 and 30, that it's no close. But 60, the thing that makes it run even faster is when we go to 60 frames per second, you can see it's going to be double the speed because that's how often it refreshes the screen, right? A little bit nicer. And this is our standard game frame rate. We make games on the web, 60 frames per second. Why? Because we want things to go a little faster, right? So that's our frame rate. So everything happens in our animation loop. Everything's going on. So if I wanted to grow and shrink, I can do another if statement, another conditional statement in here to change the size of my object every frame, right? So now I got to be careful here because I want to change my size of my object a little bit at a time until it gets to be about 100%. And when my scale is 100%, right, as an example, then I want to go down again until it's like 0.1 or something like 10%. And I can keep doing that over and over again. It's kind of I could do it, and I could do it. If I was going to do anything, it would be like that in here. Let's just make it so it gets just bigger and bigger and bigger forever. So how do I do that? So that would be like, it'll be so big the button will be like the whole size, right? So what would I do? I want to change my scale X and scale Y value up, right, every frame. And I want to do it by a certain amount. So I'm going to say, where my button X is plus equal to move, I can also do something like this. I can say button scale X, right? And again, I want to multiply it by, let's say, 10% every time. So every frame, it's going to get bigger by around 10%. So let's try this out. So we'll say times equals to, that's our shortcut, times equals to 1.1. Right? So whatever it is on our X scale, it's going to get bigger by 10% every frame. That's pretty big, actually. And let's do the same thing for the Y, our Y scale. Remember, we have both things. We have to keep proportionate, right? Because our images will be skewed otherwise. And multiply this by 1.1 as well. I'm just making this up, right? So I want to make sure that the image gets bigger every frame by 10%. And you might say, what is that? How long is it going to take to get really big? It's going to get really big really fast, right? So let's check this out. So there we go. It's really huge. It's going to be so big, in fact, it's going to be massive, and we're not going to see anything anymore. It's going to keep growing forever, right? That's crazy, right? Let's make that a little bit slower. So instead of 10%, we're going to go down to 1%, right? So 1% bigger every frame until, it gets crazy. Let's see how this works here. So here it is. It's growing, it's growing, it's growing. It'll keep growing forever until it disappears, right? Now, we can make it so that when it gets to a certain point, right? Oh, yeah, but .01. It's going to take longer, but still, eventually, it's going to be so big, it's going to be massive, right? So let's just refresh. refresh the screen again, we can see it grow, but it's going to grow so much slower. But eventually, it's going to get to the point where we have to measure how big it is. So how big do we want it? Do we want to make it from a scale perspective a certain size? Do we want to get to 100%? What do we want this thing to do? We can always do things, but we're doing size, skew something, whatever, is all going to happen inside of randomation. If I want to move a graphic, if I want to move an image, if I want to do anything with this thing, it's going to keep growing and growing. By the way, if I press on this button now, the whole button is clickable, right? So I click, so it's clicked. That's still the same functionalities there. And this is JavaScript for you, right? This is not like CSS. Until the point where, see this center area here is going to be bigger. The center, see how the center area is kind of whiter? That's what you're going to see. Eventually, it's not going to be a blue area anymore. It's going to be all white, right? Until you can't see it anymore. All right, so that's at like 0.001, right? So how do we go back to 1? So if my button.scalex, you can read my button.scalex as well. Let's print this out on the console. So if I go console.log to show what this is, and I go scalex, so button.scalex. By the way, all objects have scalex and scale y. I can do the same thing with, all bitmap objects have scalex and scale y. I can change the scale of the object. I can also flip the object if I want to. If I put a negative number for my x scale, I can flip it across the x-axis. So if I go -1, it'll flip. Like it'll actually transpose itself so that it's a flipped version of the object. Same thing with y. If I go -y, it'll flip across the y-axis as well. So let's see what this button scale, what it's doing every frame. Let's see what's happening here. So refresh, and I'll inspect. And let's look at the console. You can see how it's going up. So 0.4 scale, we're almost at 50% of the scale right now. And it's going to come to the point where my scale, I can read my scale too. When my scale becomes 100%, I want to start going the other way, right? I want to start multiplying it by, I want to start dividing it, right? How do I do that, right? Well, there's an if statement. I can say if my scale gets to be about 1, once my scale is, my x scale or I can just check on one scale or the other. I don't have to look at both because I'm keeping it proportional, so I can just check the x scale, right? So if my scale x is equal to 1, then start going the other way. Otherwise, go up the other, go up, depending on what I want to do. Let's try this out. So I can test it. I can say something like this. My button scale is like this, but if my scale is greater than or equal to 1, then greater than or equal to 1, go the other way. Otherwise, do this. How do I do that? Actually, I want to do it the other way around. I want to say something like this. If button.scalex, as an example, is less than 1, right? Careful what we do here. Then what I want to do is I want to scale both of these up, right? So I want to take this and put it here. Yay. And remember, we started off less than 1 because in our code, we're starting it off at 0.3. So it's always, that condition is going to be true initially, right? So here's our x scale at, at less than 1. But I can also do something like this. Else if our button.scale, I'm gonna reformat this in a second, scale x is greater than or equal to 1. That's also possible, right? That's the other possibility. Then what do I want to do? I want to multiply this by 0.9 or point something else every time. So it's going to drop in size. So copy and paste. So instead of multiplying it by 1.01, I want to go into something like 0.99. 9. There we go. That's about the same, right? The other way around. I'm kind of moving it slowly back down the other way, right? Until it's small again. But what happens when I get down to 0? Because there's going to be a point where it's like really tiny. So I don't want to get too small. Well, I can make that happen too. So if it's less than 1, right, but greater than 0.1, then do this. So less than 1 and greater than 0.1. So if, we'll do both conditions. If button.scale x, right, is greater than or equal to 0.1, right? That's one condition. And double ampersand, button.scale x is less than 1, right? Then do this, right? So greater than 0.1, less than 1. But if it's greater than or equal to 1 somehow, then we want to start going down the other way. But hold on a second. Once we start going down the other way, this condition will kick in. So we're never going to be, it's always going to stay around 1. So this will fail. Right, now let's fix the problems here. So we'll talk about this. Well, this is not a, remember, I don't need a loop because I'm inside of a loop. My animation loop is a loop that's going every frame, right? So this will work for 1. This will work when I get bigger, but I want to toggle this. I want to toggle this so that way when I'm growing, I want to kind of come down the other way. Now, what did I do for this one? I said, if my hello label is greater than or equal to the screen width or less than 0, one or the other, then multiply this by -1. I can't do that here because if I multiply by -1, it's just going to flip everything. I don't want to flip anything, right? I want to make it so that I have the ability for me to scale up or scale down, right? Okay. How do I do that? I can use a Boolean variable, right? Am I scaling up? What am I doing? What's the behavior I want? Or am I scaling down, right? Okay, and if I'm already scaling down, I can check to see if I'm scaling down. If I'm moving downwards, keep moving downwards until I get to 0.1, right? That's what I really want to do. Otherwise, if I'm scaling up, keep scaling up until I get to 1. So I want to go from 0.1 to 1. That's going to be my scale. In order for me to do that, I want to talk about a variable that's in the global scope here for my button. Instead of but move, I'm going to call this you know, I'll make another one called is growing. And from a default, my is growing is equal to true, right? Is growing is a Boolean variable now, right? That's how I'm treating it. If I hover over, you can see that it's a Boolean, right? That JavaScript will interpret it as a Boolean because of type inference. It's kind of trying to figure out what type of variable it is. Remember, JavaScript, there's no types, but it's trying to figure out what you want, right? Because JavaScript is loosely typed. If you assign a number, it'll say it's a number. If you assign a true or false, it'll figure that it's a Boolean type. If you make it something in quotations, it'll think it's a string, right? Here, I'm saying is growing is true by default, okay? So if is growing is true, that's in my loop, my animation loop. If, let's just scale this out. So if I'm growing, I'll fix this other if statement in a second. If, maybe I should probably specify button is growing, right? Because my button is growing or button is shrinking is really the way I want it, right? So button is growing. So if my button is growing is true, right? Then, so button is growing. If button is growing is true. Now remember, I can also do this, is equal to true, right? But equaling true is like, the short form for that is just doing this. If button is growing, right? If I put it in this syntax for JavaScript, it's the same as saying button is growing is equal to true. It's the same thing, this or this, same effect, right? If my button is growing, that's cool, right? Check to see if my button is, as an example, is less than 1. I don't need this piece, right? So let's do that piece, that piece right here. So I'm gonna get rid of this. So if my button is growing, right, then do this, right? Let's just get rid of this for a second, right? And what I want to do is I want to put my if statement inside the other one, like this. So here's my button is growing, right? And let's just format the code here for a second. Here's my button. So if my button is growing, then make sure that if I haven't hit, and if it's less than 1, then do this, right? Else, if it's not less than 1, my button now has to shrink, right? So I'm going to set else button is growing, right, is equal to false. So now it's false. So that means that when I get to greater than 1 somehow, then my button is growing is false, which means it'll skip this loop, this if statement. Okay, cool. So if this isn't true, that means I have another else condition. Now my button is shrinking, right? It's not growing anymore, right? And what I want to do is I want to keep doing this until it's greater than 0.1, right? So let's try this. So I'll say, well, if my button.scale, let's type it again, is greater than or equal to 0.1, right? Then keep doing the shrinking, which is this piece, right? What it is. Else, no, button is growing again. Here's my toggle. How do I read this thing? Is my button growing? Yes, which initially it would be. Keep growing it until my scale is less than or equal to 1, right? Actually less than 1. When my scale is greater than 1 somehow, right? This condition kicks in, and my button now is not growing anymore. The button is false, which means I'm not going to come back here, my loop, the next loop, I'm not going to come back and do this anymore. I'm going to come to this piece of my conditional statement, right? Okay, cool, my button's not growing anymore, right? So that scale, as long as my button scale is greater than 0.1, right, then I'm going to keep on reducing my scale for both the x and y coordinates by 0.99, so 0.01 every time, until my button scale is greater than or equal to 1, right? Like in a switch, no, it wouldn't be the right conditional for this one. This is kind of a nested if statement, right? That you might see, if else, right? Now you notice that it's very similar. It's a toggle, right? It's almost like identical if you look at it. If my button is growing, else it's not growing, right? Let's see what effect it has. Nice idea, Tom, right? Let's test the idea now to see if it actually works. Let's get rid of, do I do a console log anymore? Yeah, get rid of the console log. I don't need that anymore, right? It's still going to move. All that's still going to happen, but I don't need to do anything else. Let's refresh and see what happens. So it's growing. It keeps growing until it gets to 1, right? And as soon as it gets really, really big, it's going to keep going small until it gets to 0.1. Let's see what happens. So it's going to get to the size of the original button, right? Whatever the button was at 0.1. And then it's going to keep shrinking, right? Let's see, hopefully this will work, right? Until it gets to 0.1. See how it's shrinking now? All right, so it kind of grows and shrinks. Now we're only growing it and shrinking it by 0.01 every time, right? Until it gets to greater than 0.1. And then let's see if it continues, if our condition is correct, right? So all I'm looking for it to do is cycle between 0.1 and 1, right? Now it should get bigger again. Now it's really slow, so you can see that it's getting small, but this is the way to test it. Test it small, right, as an example. And then if it gets to be really too small, if it keeps going forever, right, that's bad, right? This is 0.1. Let's see. Should be moving bigger again. Let's take a look. See how it's growing again? Now it's really hard to see. Let's make it faster. So instead of 0.1 or 0.001 and 0.999, let's make it a little faster, growing and shrinking. So we'll do it really fast. We'll say 0.9, right? So it shrinks by 0.9, and it gets bigger by 0.1. So 10% growing until we get to that anything that's less than 1, and then it keeps dropping really fast. So it'll kind of grow and shrink much faster now. Okay, let's see how this works. I'll refresh. Right? Right? So you can make any kinds of these kind of effects. Now, would this be a strobing effect? Like, people remember I said don't strobing effects, because strobing effects can make people go crazy. Not a strobing effect, but it's really annoying, right? Like, I mean, it's a little bit too fast. It's kind of moving up and down a little bit fast. But the thing is, the idea here is you can scale and animate your stuff as much as you want within the animation group. Okay, questions around this? What I've been doing. A lot of this is, remember we talked about this is like the culmination of what we're doing. Why? I'm using conditional statements. We're using pretty much everything we want to do here in this particular project. I'm going to put this up on GitHub for you guys so you can see this as well. Again, this is a little bit contrived, but I can try and click on it. It's like a game, right? There it is, it's clicked, right? But what if I click on, what if I want to toggle this? Every time I click on this thing, depending on if it's clicked or not, right? I want to click it back to do something else. I can do that too, but I'd have to do another piece of code here, right? So clicking happens inside of my main function. Here's my main function where all the fun happens, right? This is where all the animation happens. All the motion happens here in my animation. An event handler that's handling the each frame, the frame event, the tick event. The tick event happens every frame, and it's managing that. Let's get rid of some of this extra space. I don't want it to confuse you. But down here, this main loop this main function only happens once, right? Well, one of the things that happens is I set up an event handler with button.on, and I say, well, when I click it, make it say clicked. Well, what if I click it again? It's going to say clicked again. What if it's already clicked? Then I want it to go back to what it said before, which is hello world, right? That's the original thing I made it say up here, right? So I said, hey, say hello world, but if I click on you, say clicked, right? Well, I want to make it say hello world again if I click on it again, if it's already clicked. How do I do that? Well, I can do something like this. If hello label dot text, I can check, is exactly equal to, clicked, right? Then what am I going to say? Say hello world, right? So I'll do this right here. But instead of hello clicked, we're going to say hello world, right? Otherwise, if my hello label else, if it's something else, then go by to say clicked. One of these. Now, there's an actual slick way of doing this. Now, I don't want to confuse you, but there's something called the ternary operator. We talked about this before, where you have two conditions, right? And depending on what the text is going to be, right? If it's already clicked, if my hello label text is already clicked, then change to hello world. Otherwise, make it clicked again, right? So what's my ternary operator? It's whatever my hello label text is going to be, right? So how do I do that? So depending on what it's a true or false or false value, right? So if it's true that hello label text is equal to clicked, right? Then do something. So if it's true, then do something. I'm just going to type it in here in layman's terms. Otherwise, do something else. This is the shorthand, right? This is how that's how it's labeled, right? And this is going to equal to something else. So whatever the value is going to be, right, is where my hello label text is going to be. So hello label text, I'm going to fill in the blanks now. I got to have a condition check, which is this one, right? So here's my condition. So copy this one in here. If this is true, right, then do something. Hello label text is equal to hello world, right? Right? Else, colon, do something else, which is hello label text is equal to clicked. This is confusing for some of you, but just bear with me. And this one line of text, see if I can show you this example, this one line of text here, right, is equal to all of this. In JavaScript, in Java, in C#, in Swift, in name the language. It's called the ternary operator, right? We've talked about this before, I believe. Let me just bring it up for you guys to see this. It's called the ternary operator. That's an actual object inside of our, in most languages. It's a conditional operator that we can use instead of using if, else, right? So it's just, I want to introduce it to you. I don't expect you to remember it or use it because it is a shorthand. But this is the great beauty of JavaScript. It accepts this kind of thing here like this, which means this is equivalent to this. For us, we're going to keep this, right? Because it's nice and easy. We're going to get rid of this for now. So I don't want to introduce too many crazy things, and I don't want you to be confused. So what am I saying here with my toggle? My toggle, I want to say, well, if I click my button, then check to see if my hello label text is equal to clicked. If it's true, then make it hello world. If it's not, make it equal to clicked. And then resize the thing to make sure it's the right size. Resize the center of it so it's the right size. Let's see if this works now with our current function. Then I'll upload everything to GitHub and we'll take a break. Okay, so going back to here, right? Here it is. And if I refresh, okay, same thing. But if I click on it, see if I can click on it. Oh, clicked. And if I click on it again, there it is. Hello world again, right? Click on it again. Oh, it's like a game. Clicked. And if I click on it again, oh, it's hello world again, right? So it'll toggle between one value and the other inside of my function, okay? Guys, this is like really contrived functionality here, but the idea is to demonstrate what you can do with Create.js and what you can do for your assignment 4, which is due next week by Thursday. It's very simple. I don't need you to do this kind of stuff. It just, you know, it could be as simple as making a snapshot that you have of a project just grow and shrink a little or move around the page. Because sometimes that's what ads do. They just kind of move around to give you kind of attention. Your eye moves to something that's moving, right? As opposed to it being a flat, static looking kind of page. Okay. Any questions around what I'm doing here or how I've set up this code? I know it seems like there's a lot of code here now, all of a sudden. Like, you know, we grew from a little bit of code to a bunch of code, right? But it doesn't take long. It doesn't take long to add more functionality as we add more JavaScript code. And this is where I wanted to get you guys to. I wanted to get you to the point where you can see the code that I'm doing and understand the functionality, even if it's not your own. Let's upload this to GitHub so you have a good example of how this works. I'm just going to upload this thing. Oops, maybe upload everything. There we go. And I'll say, added button change, button size or scale, and text toggle. That's what I've done. I'll push this up to GitHub. So it's on GitHub for COMP1073 when it actually finally goes up. It's still going. There it goes. It's up. COMP1073 lesson 12. Okay, that's the example. So please try and use that when you kind of put together your code for your assignment next week. You can use that as an example of how it works. And I'm going to be here for you for the remainder of class as a resource to help you build your assignment 4. Okay, let's do that. Let's take a short break and come back and do that.